The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song as Margaret Walsh pushed through the employee entrance at 10:24 p.m., her left leg compensating for the weight shift with the kind of precision most people mistook for a tired shuffle. 20 years of night shifts at Seattle General in Raleigh had taught her how to move through these corridors like water, present but unnoticed, efficient but invisible. The antiseptic smell hit first, as it always did, that sharp chemical bite that never quite masked the underneath scent of industrial bleach and something older, something that lived in hospital walls no matter how many times they scrubbed them clean. Her scrubs were navy blue, deliberately oversized, the kind that hid everything underneath. The ID badge clipped to her pocket read simply, Margaret Walsh, RN, Night Shift. No credentials listed. No abbreviations that might raise questions. No history before this hospital, before this city, before the careful construction of a woman who existed only from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. in Trauma Unit 3. She hung her jacket in the employee locker, a faded grey thing that had seen better decades, and that's when her fingers found the thread she'd been touching for 20 years without thinking about it. Barely visible along the inner lining, a unit patch from the 75th Ranger Regiment, stitched there by small hands in a rubble-filled hospital compound, sewn with the kind of gratitude that survived decades of silence. The lockers smelled like old metal and someone's forgotten lunch. Margaret placed a worn MRE package on the shelf next to a leather case she hadn't opened since 2004. The case held things that didn't belong in 2024, things that belonged to a different woman, a different life, a different version of Margaret Walsh who'd answered to a different rank. She closed the door, turned the lock, walked away. The night shift was predictable in the way she preferred. 3 overnight admits in the past 4 hours, all stable, all monitored. The heart monitor in Bay 4 beeped its steady rhythm like a metronome keeping time with her own heartbeat. She moved from bed to bed with the kind of economical grace that came from muscle memory so deep it no longer required thought. For bags hung like glass fruit. Vitals printed out in neat rows. Saline dripped at measured rates. This was the monastery she'd chosen, fluorescent and sterile and blessedly empty of meaning beyond the mechanical act of keeping people breathing. At 2:34 a.m., the doors burst open. Not an emergency code, the kind that brought crash carts and shouting, but something slower, heavier. A wheelchair pushed by an orderly, a man slumped in it with the kind of posture that said a lifetime of paralysis. The chart read, David Ramos, age 28, admitted for post-surgical evaluation. Special Forces, medical discharge. Spinal cord injury, thoracic level. Margaret was updating the full log when she felt it. Not saw it. Felt it. The way the air in the room changed when someone was looking at you with a weight behind their eyes. Recognition has a frequency. It travels differently than casual observation. Her hand stopped moving. The pen froze at the edge of the page. Slowly enough that it looked like normal motion, she turned her head. David Ramos's eyes met hers across the width of the unit, and in that space between them, 20 years collapsed like a building coming down. His face was harder now, chiseled by pain and time and whatever it meant to be a broken Special Forces operator at 28. But his eyes were the same eyes she'd last seen covered in dust and tears and shock, staring up at her from underneath 6 feet of collapsed concrete in Bagram. She was pulling him out, pulling him away, her hands on his small shoulders, his voice in her ear saying, "Soldier? Soldier, can you hear me?" And Margaret, Major Margaret Walsh then, medic with blood on her hands and a mission still running hot in her veins, had said, "I've got you. I've got you, son." That boy had been 8 years old. Now he was a man in a wheelchair, and he was staring at her like he'd just seen a ghost. Like he'd just seen Major Margaret Walsh walk out of 20 years and into a pair of oversized scrubs at 2:34 a.m. in a hospital in Raleigh, North Carolina. Her hands trembled. She set down the pen. Kept her face level. But her hands, those hands that had held steady through firefights and hemorrhages and the worst kind of human suffering, trembled against the edge of the desk like they belonged to a stranger. Muscle memory was supposed to be reliable. It was supposed to be the body's autopilot, the unconscious competence that took over when the conscious mind broke down. But muscle memory was also a liar. It could betray you. It could remember things your conscious mind had spent 20 years burying. David's mouth opened slightly. He looked like he might speak. The orderly was already turning back, already moving away, already not noticing the seismic shift in the room. Nobody else on night shift noticed either. Jenkins was charting at Station 2. The resident was in the back reviewing labs. The world kept its rhythm. Only Margaret and David knew that the ground had moved. She turned back to her log. Finished the line she'd started. Wrote, 2:34 a.m., new admission, Bay 6. Vital stable. For access established. Her handwriting was steady. The handwriting of someone who had control. The handwriting of someone who absolutely did not just have her entire buried past wheel into her unit and look at her like she was the last person he expected to see alive. From his office, the glass-walled command center that overlooked the unit, Dr. Ashford had been watching the monitors, the same monitors that displayed patient stats and bed occupancy and EKG rhythms. But he'd also been watching the staff. It was something he did, the way other men collected golf scorecards or read quarterly reports. He watched how people moved. How they reacted. How they failed to maintain professional distance. He'd been chief of medicine for 8 months, and in those 8 months, he'd already transformed the unit's protocol adherence metrics from 74% to 92%. Not because he was a better doctor, Dr. Ashford was competent enough, the kind of physician who'd learned his procedures from textbooks and his people skills from business seminars, but because he understood that hospitals, like any institution, responded to pressure. And Dr. Ashford had learned that the application of consistent, measured pressure could reshape almost anything into the form he desired. He'd noted Margaret Walsh on his first day. Night shift nurse, 20 years at the institution, never promoted, never complained, never drew attention. The kind of invisible resource that made institutions run smoothly. She was useful in that way, reliable, quiet, unambitious. She didn't threaten the hierarchy he was constructing. Didn't ask questions about his budget reallocations or his decision to reduce nursing staff on night shift by 20%. Didn't challenge him publicly or privately. Just showed up in her oversized scrubs and moved through the unit like a ghost. Until 2:34 a.m., when the new admission arrived in Bay 6, and Margaret Walsh's hands trembled on a desk. Dr. Ashford set down his coffee, a $6 latte he'd purchased from the hospital cafe at 2 a.m., because his circadian rhythms refused to acknowledge that night existed, and leaned forward. Trembling was an interesting indicator. Trembling suggested emotional involvement. Emotional involvement was a vector for protocol violations. And protocol violations were exactly what his board presentation next month needed. He pulled up the admissions file and made a note. Margaret moved to Bay 6 to take David's initial vitals, her movements deliberate, controlled, the kind of careful choreography that comes from knowing you're being watched. She didn't look at him directly. Looked at the monitor instead, at the numbers, at the objective data. Heart rate 92. Blood pressure stable. O2 sat 98% on room air. The body's story, cleanly separated from whatever story existed behind his eyes. Comfortable, she asked, her voice its usual register, low, level, the kind of voice that never raised even when trauma bays exploded into chaos. 8 words. Professional. Distant. You know me, David said quietly. Not a question. A statement. An identification. You got me out. The room went dead silent. The ventilator in Bay 4 continued its mechanical breathing. The heart monitor kept its metronome rhythm. The fluorescent lights buzzed their fluorescent hum. But in Bay 6, in the space between a nurse who'd spent 20 years pretending to be nobody and a man who'd just realized she was somebody after all, the silence was total and complete and absolutely damning. Margaret checked the 4 line. Adjusted the monitor leads. Performed the 1,000 small tasks that filled silence with purpose. You should rest, she said finally. Your body's been through trauma. She was already turning to leave when David's voice came again, softer now, almost broken. Major? I never got to rest, she said. Not unkind, but final. The word closed a door. Margaret walked back to Station 2, picked up the log, and pretended the next 6 hours would be routine. Pretended her hands weren't still trembling. Pretended the past wasn't sitting in Bay 6 in a wheelchair, staring at her like she was the only real thing in a world of machines and monitors. From his office, Dr. Ashford made another note. The trembling had stopped, but he'd seen it. He'd catalogued it. He'd begun, without quite knowing it yet, to understand that there was something about Margaret Walsh that didn't fit the invisible nurse narrative. Something underneath the surface that might be useful. Might be threatening. Might be exactly what he needed to solidify his position as a man who could control anything, even the people who thought they were beyond his reach. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd already begun planning something he didn't yet understand. Dr. Ashford summoned Margaret to David's room 20 minutes later, and she knew before she arrived that this wasn't a clinical consultation. The hallway outside 412 was crowded. David's parents stood at the foot of the bed, his sister gripping the metal railing, two aunts flanking them like sentries. Dr. Ashford waited by the window with his arms crossed, coffee cooling in a ceramic mug that bore the Hospital Foundation's logo. He smiled when she entered, the kind of smile a predator shows before it strikes. "Nurse Walsh," he announced, loud enough that nurses at the station could hear, "this is an excellent teaching moment about professional boundaries." He gestured to David's family as though presenting evidence at trial. "I apologize that you have to witness this, but your son deserves caregivers who maintain appropriate emotional distance." Margaret's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She stood at parade rest without thinking, feet shoulder-width apart, hands at her sides, a posture she hadn't assumed in 20 years. It made her visible in exactly the way she'd spent 2 decades trying not to be. "I observed Nurse Walsh holding the patient's hand for nearly 8 minutes, Dr. Ashford continued, his voice carrying the smooth certainty of a man who'd never been contradicted by institutional power. "This isn't a living room, Ms. Walsh. This is a medical facility." He turned to David with practiced sympathy, the kind that cost nothing and meant less. "Mr. Ramos, please understand, nurses like Grandma here sometimes forget they're not treating family." The word hung in the air like diesel exhaust on a hot runway. "Grandma." Margaret felt David's eyes snap toward her, searching for permission to explode, but she gave him nothing, no signal, no acknowledgement, no crack in the surface. Her hands remained steady. Her breathing remained even. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She took one measured breath through her nose and met Dr. Ashford's gaze without blinking. "Some of us remember when healing meant more than billing codes," she said quietly. Not a question. Not a request for forgiveness. A statement of fact delivered in a voice that sounded like a tank idling in a garage, present, dangerous, perfectly controlled. The silence stretched for 5 seconds. Dr. Ashford's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. David's mother reached for her son's shoulder. Margaret turned and left the room without waiting for dismissal, her shoes making soft clicking sounds against the tile floor as she walked back toward the nursing station, aware of every eye that followed her, aware that she'd just made a choice that couldn't be unmade. That night in the break room, the fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song and Margaret sat alone with her dinner, a container of rice and curry she'd prepared at home, the kind of meal that tasted like places she'd promised herself she'd never think about again. 3 nurses entered, saw her, made eye contact that lasted exactly half a second too long, and left without a word. Sarah would have stayed. Sarah would have sat down beside her and said something useless and kind. But Sarah had been reassigned to pediatrics that morning, a memo signed by Dr. Ashford citing staffing optimization needs. The next morning, Margaret found the write-up pinned to the unit board where every staff member would see it during shift change. The paper was cream-colored, official, stamped with the hospital logo. The words were typed in precise Arial font, violation of professional boundaries, Nurse Ember Walsh, formal written warning. Below that, a paragraph describing her conduct in clinical terms that made human touch sound like a criminal act. Dr. Ashford stood by his office window 15 feet away, coffee in hand, watching her read it. He didn't look away when she glanced up at him. He just raised the mug to his lips and held her gaze, and in that moment Margaret understood exactly what this was, not an administrative action, but a performance. A public demonstration that he could mark her, that he could make her visible in exactly the way she'd spent 2 decades avoiding. She unpinned the write-up carefully, folded it once, and placed it in her locker beside the sealed leather case that held her discharge papers and her Purple Heart. The document's edge caught on the faded unit patch she'd sewn into her jacket lining, the patch from 2003, stitched there by a boy who was 8 years old and alive because she'd crawled through rubble to find him. Over the following week, Dr. Ashford began making his strategic moves with the precision of a chess player who'd already calculated 5 moves ahead. He reassigned Sarah, Margaret's best supporting nurse, to pediatrics permanently. He altered the duty roster so Margaret worked opposite shifts from the competent residents, pairing her instead with Dr. Chen, the first year who still checked protocols twice before writing orders. He made 3 phone calls to board members about staffing quality concerns and liability patterns we should monitor, calls that were careful never to mention Margaret by name, which made them infinitely more damaging. He restricted her access to the controlled medication room, implementing a new protocol that required supervisor override for every withdrawal, turning a 40-second task into a 15-minute bureaucratic exercise. He documented it all, each incident, each pattern, each deviation no matter how minor, building a file that would look like evidence to anyone who didn't understand that documentation was weaponized gossip wearing a badge. And he reassigned David's room to the far end of the unit, away from the nursing station, away from the monitors, away from where Margaret could glance up and watch his oxygen levels trend downward without raising suspicion. The isolation was total and deliberate. It had the feel of a technique, something Dr. Ashford had learned from someone else who understood that breaking people didn't require shouting, it required patience and the slow removal of every piece of support until they stood alone in a room full of colleagues. Margaret felt it working. She felt the shift in how nurses spoke to her, shorter exchanges, fewer questions, the kind of cold professionalism that meant she'd been deemed a liability. She felt Sarah avoiding her in the hallway. She felt the residents' hesitation when she made suggestions about patient care, the slight delay before they acknowledged her, the way they'd glance toward Dr. Ashford's office before responding. What she didn't feel was fear. That surprised her. The trembling she'd allowed herself in the break room, that single tear in front of David's family, that had been the last piece of Margaret the civilian nurse that she permitted herself to shed. Now, sitting in her apartment after night shifts, staring at the leather case in her locker's photo on her phone, she felt something else settling into place. Something older. Something that had been buried under scrubs and night shifts and the carefully constructed fiction that Major Margaret Walsh had died in Bagram alongside the man whose leg she couldn't save and the 3 Marines who'd been standing too close to the IED when it detonated. She was still invisible. But the invisibility was changing. It was becoming something harder, something more dangerous. It was becoming a choice instead of a default. And then, during her shift on Friday night, David's monitor alarm began to scream. Friday night arrived like all the others, fluorescent-lit corridors, the smell of antiseptic cutting through something deeper, something like fear. Margaret clocked in at 11:19 p.m. and walked toward the unit, her pace deliberate, her limp barely visible under the soft rhythm of her gait. The night shift stretched ahead of her like every night shift for the last 2 decades, medications, vital signs, the quiet vigilance of someone who'd learned to see danger before it announced itself. She stopped at the assignment board. Her name beside David's room number had been erased and replaced with a new one. Room 847. The far end of the unit. Almost 50 meters from the nursing station, positioned on a corridor nobody moved through except to reach the stairwell. The reassignment wasn't accidental. Margaret knew protocol well enough to know that isolation was strategy. She'd used isolation herself in Bagram, separate the wounded from support, and you control who survives. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench. She simply walked to room 847, carrying her tablet, moving through the unit like a woman who'd already accepted what was coming. David was asleep when she arrived, his breathing steady, his color good. She checked his vitals methodically. Blood pressure 118/72. Heart rate 68. Oxygen saturation 98% on 2 liters of nasal cannula. She recorded each number with the precision that had kept her alive through 3 tours in places where precision meant the difference between a scar and a grave. His sister had left hours ago. The family waiting room was empty. David's chart showed no other visitors scheduled, no family expected until morning rounds at 9 a.m. 12 hours from now. Margaret understood what that meant. She'd worked enough hospital politics to recognize escalation when she saw it. Dr. Ashford wasn't stupid, he was methodical, which was worse. Stupid men made mistakes. Methodical men made plans. By moving her to the far end of the unit and stationing her as David's sole nurse, he'd created a scenario. If anything happened to David during the night, Margaret would be the only person immediately available. The on-call resident, a third-year named Chen who'd seemed competent enough during afternoon rounds, had been reassigned. Margaret had overheard Dr. Ashford on the phone that afternoon, his voice smooth as oil. Dr. Chen will be stationed at the satellite clinic on the East Campus. Yes, I know it's unusual. We're doing inventory. Should take most of the night. 50 minutes away. On foot, in an emergency, that was the difference between a save and a body on a stretcher. Margaret settled into the chair beside David's bed and waited. The night moved around her in its familiar rhythm, the hum of machines, the distant murmur of voices at the nursing station, the occasional code call over the intercom from other units. She'd worked enough night shifts to understand that most of them passed in quiet routine, that the real danger came in the small hours after 3 a.m. when bodies weakened and monitor alarms screamed in hallways that suddenly felt infinite. She opened David's chart on her tablet and reviewed his history. Paralysis from T for spinal cord injury, a direct hit from shrapnel when his Humvee hit an IED outside Kandahar. 28 years old. No significant comorbidities. No reason for his condition to deteriorate. He was stable. He should stay stable. But Margaret had learned long ago that should was a word civilians used. At 2:33 a.m., his breathing changed. It wasn't dramatic. No alarm screamed. His oxygen saturation monitor still showed 96%, which was within normal range. But Margaret heard it the moment she walked back into the room, a subtle shift in his respiratory rhythm, a tightness that hadn't been there before. She'd heard that sound in the field clinic at Bagram, in the dark before dawn, on patients who'd taken shrapnel to the chest and didn't know yet that their lungs were collapsing into themselves. She moved to his bedside. His eyes were still closed, but his forehead had beaded with sweat. She placed a hand on his chest and felt it immediately, the slight asymmetry in chest wall movement. Left side moving less than the right. Shallow breathing. The kind of breathing that belonged to someone whose lungs were being crushed by air trapped in the space between the lung and the chest wall. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of thing that killed soldiers in minutes if you didn't know what you were looking at. The kind of thing that felt invisible on a normal X-ray until the patient coded. The kind of thing that required immediate decompression or David would be dead before morning rounds. Margaret's hands moved to his pulse points, taking readings like muscle memory took over. His neck veins were distending slightly, another sign. His skin was cool and clammy under her fingers. Tachycardic. She pulled his shirt up and looked at his chest, checking for the subtle signs most nurses would miss. The slight barrel shape of his ribs. The way the skin moved wrong when he breathed. Her mind moved like it had in Bagram, not in words, but in images and data. Pain is information. Every sign was a sentence written in the language of trauma. This patient's body was telling her that his left lung was collapsing, that air was building pressure in his chest cavity, that with each breath he took, he was pushing more air into a space with nowhere for it to go. She glanced at the monitor. Oxygen saturation dropping. 94%. 92%. Stable heartbeat, but it wouldn't stay stable. The pressure building in his chest was like a fist tightening around his heart. His body was running out of time. Margaret walked to her locker without running. Running would draw attention. She moved like someone getting supplies for a routine task, and nobody at the nursing station. 2 people absorbed in charting and a half-full pot of terrible coffee looked up as she passed. Her locker opened with its familiar creak, and she reached past the leather case with its seal unbroken after 2 decades, past the jacket with its hidden patch, and found what she'd kept since Bagram. The emergency MRE package, wrapped in plastic, dated from 2004. Some nurses kept extra bandages. Some kept hand sanitizer. Margaret kept the things that had saved lives when there was nothing else between a patient and death. She returned to room 847 and locked the door behind her. "David! Wake up!" Her voice was steady, the voice of someone who'd given orders in languages that used different words but understood the same dialect of authority. "I need you to stay very still." His eyes opened. Terror flooded them immediately because he was military, because his body already knew it was dying. "Tension pneumothorax," she said. "Your left lung is collapsing. I'm going to decompress it. You're going to survive this." She didn't wait for permission. Permission was something you asked for when time was optional. She pulled the sterile packet from the MRE package, Israeli bandage, designed for battlefield trauma, designed for the exact moment when a soldier's body was running out of air. The needle was 14 gauge, the kind that slid between ribs like it belonged there because on 1,000 battlefields, it had. Her hands moved without hesitation. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The anatomy was the same whether you were in a tent in Bagram or a private room at Seattle General. She found the space between his ribs and pushed the needle through the chest wall. The hiss of air escaping. The pressure releasing like a held breath finally exhaled. His oxygen saturation jumped immediately. 94%. 96%. 98%. His breathing deepened. The barrel shape of his ribs relaxed. The sweat on his forehead began to dry. "Breathe," she said, and it wasn't a request. It was a command given to a soldier who understood commands. He breathed. His body obeyed because her voice carried the weight of someone who'd kept people alive in places where death arrived without warning. She secured the needle with tape, careful, precise, the kind of work hands did when they'd done it 1,000 times before, and stepped back to the monitor. Sinus rhythm. Oxygen saturation stable at 97%. Blood pressure stabilizing. Everything that had been crashing was now climbing back toward normal. Margaret pulled her phone from her pocket and called the nursing station. "Code team. Room 847. Patient presented with acute tension pneumothorax. Needle decompression performed 3 minutes ago. Vitals now stable. Status, pending physician evaluation." There was a pause. A long one. "Margaret, did you say you performed a needle decompression?" "Correct." She kept her voice flat, information only, the way you reported facts when facts were about survival. "Patient was deteriorating. Decompression necessary. Patient is now stable. Call Dr. Ashford." The code team arrived 4 minutes later. A respiratory technician, a resident from the trauma service, 2 nurses with a stretcher that wouldn't be necessary. They moved into the room like people walking into the aftermath of something none of them understood. The chest seal. The tape. The patient breathing steadily, oxygen saturation locked at 97%, the kind of stable that shouldn't have happened without a physician present. Dr. Chen never came. He was still at the East Campus clinic, inventorying supplies that didn't need inventorying. But Dr. Ashford received a call at 3:15 a.m., and by 6:19 a.m., he was in his office reviewing security footage with 2 board members sitting across from his desk. The camera had caught everything, Margaret moving with the precision of muscle memory, the needle sliding in, the hiss of air, David's body relaxing into stability. Dr. Ashford's jaw tightened as he watched. "An unauthorized invasive procedure," he said, pointing at the screen. His voice was calm, the kind of calm that came from seeing an opportunity. "Without physician oversight. This is exactly what I was concerned about, a nurse who thinks she can perform procedures beyond her scope." One board member leaned forward. "The patient survived." "That's not the relevant metric," Dr. Ashford replied, and in that moment, Margaret would have understood if she'd been there to see it, that he wasn't interested in what was right. He was interested in what was useful. David's survival was an obstacle to his narrative, not a victory. The relevant metric is institutional integrity. If we allow nurses to perform procedures unilaterally, we lose all accountability structure. We lose control. He made 3 phone calls before 10 a.m. 1 to the state nursing board. 1 to the hospital's legal team. 1 to a physician he knew who'd written papers on scope of practice violations and owed him a favor. By noon, Margaret had been called to an emergency administrative hearing that she hadn't known was coming, couldn't have prepared for, and couldn't have prevented. She sat across from 3 administrators in a room that smelled like leather and failure, her limp visible as she crossed to her chair, her hands folded in her lap like they belonged to someone else. Dr. Ashford presented printed screenshots. Highlighted policy violations. A prepared statement from a physician who'd never met her, never examined David, never understood the difference between a procedure and a save. A pattern of boundary violations, Dr. Ashford said, his voice carrying the certainty of a man who'd won before the hearing started. Emotional instability. And now dangerous medical practice beyond her qualification. I recommend immediate suspension pending full investigation. The panel deliberated for 8 minutes. Margaret's suspension began at 2:51 p.m. The industrial washers hummed their monotonous rhythm as Margaret folded the last set of scrubs. 3 hours. 3 hours since security had escorted her from Seattle General's trauma unit, her badge already deactivated, her access codes revoked before her feet touched the employee parking lot. The laundry room smelled of bleach and steam, a chemical fog that burned her sinuses as she creased each folded set with the same precision she'd once used for her dress uniform, hospital corners, exact angles, muscle memory from 2 decades of military discipline applied now to the last remnants of her civilian life. Her hands shook, but she forced them steady. This small indignity, this final task she'd requested before leaving, had become her anchor, something to do with her hands that wasn't breaking down, wasn't calling Jackson back, wasn't sitting in her car in the parking lot wondering how she'd explain to a 17-year-old why his mother had just become unemployable. The suspension letter sat folded in her scrub pocket. Asterisk violation of professional boundaries. Unauthorized invasive procedure without physician authorization. Dangerous deviation from established protocol. Pending investigation into fitness for practice. Dr. Ashford's words, typed by the hospital legal team, presented as though Margaret had committed a crime rather than saving a man's life. But that wasn't how it had started. For hours earlier, during her isolation on the night shift, David Ramos's oxygen saturation had dropped like a stone. 88, 82. 76, the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm, but the numbers kept falling, and Margaret recognized it instantly, the specific tension of a collapsed lung, the way air builds pressure inside the pleural cavity until the heart has nowhere to expand. Tension pneumothorax. Bagram's signature wound. She'd seen it 100 times on the surgical ward, watched it kill soldiers in minutes if you weren't fast. Dr. Ashford had deliberately stationed the on-call resident, Dr. Chen, in the radiology department on the opposite side of the hospital. Margaret knew it was deliberate because she'd reviewed the assignment sheet that morning. Ashford had been documenting everything, every time she touched a patient, every moment she lingered, every word she spoke that suggested emotional connection. He was building a file. Building a case. She'd understood his strategy perfectly: isolate her from support staff, restrict her access to decision-making physicians, create situations where she'd either have to wait for help or act without authorization. This was the situation he'd created. Margaret didn't page Dr. Chen. She didn't wait for the on-call resident to make the 10-minute journey from radiology. She moved instead to her locker and retrieved the small cloth pouch she kept in the bottom, an Israeli field dressing, the kind issued to combat medics, salvaged from an old MRE package she'd carried home from Bagram. The muscle memory didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt like coming home. She prepped David's chest at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, textbook needle decompression, the same procedure she'd performed on 17 soldiers during the siege, the procedure that kept people breathing when their lungs gave up. The 14-gauge angiocath needle slid through skin and muscle with barely a resistance. The hiss of air escaping. That beautiful, terrible hiss that meant the pressure was releasing, meant he could breathe again. O2 sat climbed. 78, 84. 91. By the time the code team arrived 3 minutes later, David's vitals had stabilized enough that what could have been a bilateral chest tube became a situation they could manage in controlled fashion. A surgical save instead of an emergency code. The team lead, a surgeon named Brennan who'd always been decent to Margaret, took one look at the needle placement and the vital signs and asked quietly, "Who did this?" Margaret was already walking away. "I'm going on break," she said. She should have known better. She should have known Ashford would check the security footage. She should have anticipated that he'd been waiting for her to break protocol, waiting for his moment to move from documentation to destruction. But she'd been thinking like a nurse, not like someone being hunted by an administrator building a case. At 6:38 a.m., with the sun not yet risen, Dr. Ashford reviewed the security footage in his office with 3 board members present. Margaret watched him later, in her memory of the scene she wasn't present for but could imagine perfectly, pointing at the screen where she retrieved the Israeli dressing, pointing at the moment she prepped David's chest, pointing at the needle advancing into the pleural space. "Unauthorized invasive procedure," he said. "Without physician authorization. Without proper equipment. Dangerous deviation from protocol." His voice would have carried concern, worry about patient safety, about the integrity of the institution. They were trained to hear those careful words as leadership. What they didn't know was that Ashford had made a call at 5:16 a.m. to the chief of surgery before even reviewing the footage. What they didn't know was that he'd already contacted the state medical board liaison. What they didn't know was that he'd prepared this suspension the same way a chess player moves 3 pieces ahead, not reacting to Margaret's life-saving action, but using it as the final justification for removing her entirely. By 2:51 p.m., the administrative hearing had lasted 8 minutes. 8 minutes for Margaret to sit across from Ashford and a hospital counsel and explain that she'd acted to prevent a patient's death. 8 minutes for them to nod and take notes. 8 minutes before the decision was read aloud, suspended pending investigation, effective immediately, access to the facility revoked, credentials under review. She walked to the laundry room because she needed to move, needed something to do that wasn't thinking about how David would look when he woke up and she wasn't there, whether he'd understand that she'd tried to protect him from this, that everything she'd done since the moment he wheeled into her unit had been about keeping him safe. She'd hidden her past because the IED that shredded her leg in Bagram had ended everything, not just her military career, but her entire identity as Major Margaret Walsh, the woman who'd saved 43 lives during the siege. The army had offered her a desk job, medical corps, retirement with honors. She'd refused. She'd taken her disability pension and her scars and her classified memories and become Margaret Walsh, the civilian nurse, someone small enough to be invisible, someone who could heal without the weight of command, without the ghosts of all those soldiers who'd died anyway. But David's arrival had pulled every buried truth to the surface. And now, even this smaller life was being stripped away by a man who'd never heard a shot fired in anger, who measured leadership in billing codes and protocol compliance, who saw a nurse's devotion to a patient as a threat to be neutralized rather than a virtue to be honored. Margaret placed the last folded set of scrubs on the sorting cart and sat on the concrete bench, her ruined leg throbbing with the deep ache that came with exhaustion. The muscle in her left thigh had never fully recovered from the blast, scar tissue and weakness, a permanent reminder of what she'd been. Above her, through the concrete ceiling, she could hear the hospital continuing. A code being called somewhere on the 3rd floor. The muffled sound of pages turned, conversations held, life moving forward without her. Her phone showed 17 missed calls. Jackson. Her son had called 17 times in 3 hours. She didn't call back. What would she say? That she'd been suspended from her job for saving someone's life? That the man she'd told him about, the patient who seemed to mean something, had been the reason her career just collapsed? That sometimes doing the right thing and losing everything happened at exactly the same moment? She sat alone in the laundry room smelling bleach and steam and wondered if this was how her military service was supposed to end, not with a ceremony or honors, but with the quiet dissolution of a life she'd built from nothing, folding scrubs in a basement while the world moved on above her. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part hadn't even arrived yet. At 3:11 p.m., in the hospital conference room on the second floor, Dr. Ashford stood at a podium in front of 8 reporters and 2 rolling cameras, midway through his second answer about institutional protocols and patient safety. He was explaining his difficult decision with the careful, measured tone of a leader making hard choices for the greater good when the double doors burst open with enough force to make 3 people flinch. Jackson Walsh, 17 years old, his mother's eyes and his grandmother's stubbornness, stood in the doorway holding a shadow box. The kind that holds military medals. The kind that holds a life that's supposed to stay buried. "Mom, they need to see these," Jackson shouted across the room, his voice cracking with rage. "You don't get to be erased." He slammed the shadow box onto the conference table. Medals scattered across the polished wood like accusations. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Combat Medical Badge. Meritorious Service Medal. Each one gleaming under the conference room lights, each one a moment from a life Margaret Walsh had locked away so carefully that her own son hadn't known they existed until today. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. Jackson lifted the nameplate with shaking hands and read it aloud, "Major Margaret Walsh, United States Army." Dr. Ashford opened his mouth but no words came out. He looked like a man watching his entire narrative collapse in real time. One of Margaret's former unit nurses stepped forward from the back of the room, Elena Rodriguez, who'd worked night shift with her for 6 years and never known. Elena picked up the Purple Heart with trembling hands. "Margaret never told us," she whispered, then louder, her voice steadying, "This is for wounds received in combat. This woman bled for us." She read the citation aloud, the words printed on aged paper, "for wounds received during enemy action in Bagram, Afghanistan, while treating casualties under direct fire." Reporters began frantically typing. One of them asked, "Who is Margaret Walsh?" The door opened again. A man in a wheelchair rolled in, Commander James Mitchell, Navy SEAL, retired, his chest covered in ribbons. David had called him. David, still in his hospital bed, had figured out what Margaret had been trying to protect him from and made one call that changed everything. "Major Walsh," Mitchell said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from commanding men in combat, "saved my life in Bagram. She operated on me for 6 hours in a bunker while mortars hit overhead. She earned the Bronze Star with Valor device." He paused, rolled forward, picked up each medal. "That V means she did it under enemy fire. She earned the Combat Medical Badge, that means she returned fire while treating casualties. She earned the Meritorious Service Medal for exceptional leadership during the Bagram siege." Staff members from the hallway pressed into the room, drawn by the force of the moment. One nurse pressed her hands to her mouth. Another stood frozen, jaw slack. A resident grabbed the doorframe for support. Dr. Ashford tried to speak, "While this is certainly admirable history, it doesn't change the fact that..." Mitchell rolled directly over his foot, cutting him off completely. "The fact is you suspended a decorated combat surgeon for performing the exact needle decompression she used to save 17 soldiers. That's what you're telling these cameras." The hospital CEO's phone rang. She answered on speaker without thinking. "This is Admiral Patricia Richardson, Pentagon liaison. I'm calling to confirm that Major Margaret Walsh has been personally recommended for the Armed Forces Medical Service Distinguished Service Medal for saving 43 lives during the Bagram siege. Is she available?" The line crackled between the words, and in that static space, everything changed. Dr. Ashford backed slowly into the podium, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, as the CEO's face went white and the reporters' pens moved faster, and Margaret Walsh, folding scrubs in a laundry room 3 floors below, didn't yet know that her past had just arrived to reclaim her future. Jackson didn't knock. He pushed through the administrative office doors like a Marine entering a contested building, his 17-year-old frame moving with purpose that made 3 hospital administrators step back. In his hands, a wooden shadow box, glass front, lined with red velvet. Inside, arranged with military precision, medals catching the fluorescent light like captured stars. Dr. Ashford stood at the podium mid-sentence, his prepared statement about protocol and institutional standards dying in his throat. The press conference he'd called to control the narrative, to explain the suspension, to position himself as a guardian of medical excellence, had lasted exactly 4 minutes before his phone buzzed with the Pentagon liaison call. He dismissed the reporters with a promise to address their questions later, thinking he had time to strategize, to find lawyers, to spin the story back toward his favor. He had no idea his patient's best friend was a Navy SEAL commander with a clearance and a cell phone. Jackson walked straight to the conference table and dropped the shadow box with a sound like a gunshot. The glass front rattled. Medals shifted. One rolled across the polished surface and stopped directly in front of Dr. Ashford's chest. "Mom, they need to see these," Jackson said, his voice cracking like he'd been practicing this moment for 3 hours in his car. "You don't get to be erased." The room froze. Reporters' phones came up. Cameras swiveled. Dr. Ashford's face cycled from confusion to something that looked almost like comprehension, the dawning realization that the narrative he'd controlled was about to slip entirely from his hands. Jackson's hands trembled as he reached into the shadow box and lifted a framed nameplate. His voice steadied as he read it aloud, "Major Margaret Walsh, United States Army." Each word hit like a hammer strike. Major. Margaret Walsh. Not a night shift nurse. Not a protocol violator. Major. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick with the sound of smartphones recording, pen stopping mid-note, a hospital CEO's breath catching in his throat. A decorated SEAL commander, David's former platoon leader, call sign a breaker, who'd flown up from San Diego on his own dime the moment he heard a nurse at Seattle General had saved his boy, stepped forward from the back of the room. He was still in dress uniform, still carrying the weight of 20 years and 3 deployments like it was part of his spine. He didn't ask permission. He didn't introduce himself. He simply reached into the shadow box and lifted each medal, holding them where the cameras could see, speaking each name with the precision of someone reading a casualty report. Bronze Star with Valor. He paused. Reactions rippled through the room, whispers, gasps, one reporter actually writing the words down as if she needed proof that this was real. Combat Medical Badge. A nurse in the back picked up a Purple Heart with trembling hands, the kind of trembling that comes from recognizing something sacred you weren't supposed to be holding. Meritorious Service Medal. Breaker's voice didn't waver. He knew what these decorations meant. He knew what they cost. He'd watched Margaret pull a kid, the same kid who'd walked into Seattle General on wheels 4 weeks ago, out of a bombed-out compound while rounds impacted concrete around them. 2 Purple Hearts. The words hung in the air like smoke. 2. Not 1. Not a mistake. 2 separate instances of putting her body between danger and someone else's life. The hospital CEO's phone rang on the conference table. Everyone heard it. The CEO stared at the number display for exactly 2 seconds before picking up. Yes? His face went the color of old bone. I understand. Yes. Yes, Madam Secretary, I'm putting you on speaker. The voice that filled the room was calm. Measured. The kind of calm that comes from being accustomed to giving orders that reshape nations. This is Secretary of Defense Linda Hartwell. I'm informed that Major Margaret Walsh, a decorated combat surgeon with 43 confirmed saves during the Bagram siege, was suspended from employment for performing a needle decompression procedure. The identical procedure she used to save Staff Sergeant David Ramos, who holds the Congressional Medal of Honor. Dr. Ashford, I have your medical license in front of me. It says your specialty is administrative efficiency. Can you explain how suspending a major who saved a Medal of Honor recipient qualifies as protocol enforcement? Dr. Ashford opened his mouth. Closed it. His former authority, the institutional power he'd spent 20 years accumulating, the board connections, the reputation for decisive action, the carefully cultivated image of a serious administrator, evaporated in real time, like water on hot asphalt. I acted based on the information available, he started. You acted based on ego, the secretary said, her voice still level, still ice. I've reviewed the security footage. You deliberately stationed the on-call resident in another building. You isolated Major Walsh from supporting staff. You created the emergency that required her intervention, then suspended her for responding to it. That's not protocol enforcement, Doctor. That's sabotage. My office will be contacting your board of directors within the hour. The line went dead. For 3 seconds, nobody moved. Then the press conference collapsed into chaos, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, Dr. Ashford stepping backward toward the door like he was trying to remember where the exits were. Jackson stood beside the shadow box, his hand resting on the glass, looking at the medals inside like he couldn't quite believe they'd been real all this time. By 6:48 p.m. that evening, Dr. Ashford was sitting in the bright lights of Channel 7's broadcast studio, his expensive suit pressed, his talking points memorized, attempting to control a narrative that had already moved 3 moves ahead of him. The anchor was professional, almost sympathetic, which somehow made it worse. Dr. Ashford, can you walk us through your decision-making process regarding Major Walsh's suspension? He started with protocol. Institutional standards. The importance of hierarchy in medical environments. His words came out smooth, practiced, the language of someone accustomed to being believed because he occupied a position of authority. It wasn't even a lie, technically. It was just a carefully edited version of truth, with all the inconvenient details removed. The anchor's phone lit up. She glanced at it, and her expression shifted, just slightly, just enough that everyone watching knew something had changed. Dr. Ashford, I'm being told we have an incoming call. They're requesting to go live on air. Before he could respond, before he could object or stall or find some procedural reason to decline, a voice filled the studio. Not transmitted through a speaker. Not filtered through a phone line. Broadcast live, clear as if she was sitting in the third chair. This is Secretary of Defense Linda Hartwell. The anchor's hands froze above her desk. Dr. Ashford's jaw went tight. Am I speaking with Dr. Ashford? The secretary continued, her tone conversational in a way that made the question sound like a death sentence. Yes, Madam Secretary, the anchor said, her voice smaller than before. You're live. Dr. Ashford, I've had a fascinating evening. I've read your employment records. I've watched the security footage of your movement patterns, the way you positioned staff, the way you restricted access. And I've reviewed the medical literature on tension pneumothorax. Your Major Walsh performed the correct procedure at the correct moment with equipment that shouldn't have worked but did. She saved a life using battlefield medicine and 20 years of experience. And you suspended her for it. Tell me, Doctor, in your administrative training, do they teach you to identify excellence and then destroy it? Or is that just your special innovation? Dr. Ashford's mouth opened. Closed. His face had taken on the color of old rust. The situation is more complex, he attempted. It's actually quite simple, the secretary interrupted, her voice never rising, never wavering. A nurse saved a soldier. You punished her for it. I'm curious what the State Medical Licensing Board will think about that decision. I'm also curious what your board of directors will think when I call them in approximately 10 minutes. I'll be recommending they consider whether your license reflects the same level of excellence as your media appearances. Good evening, Doctor. The broadcast ended abruptly. The anchor looked at the camera like she wasn't entirely sure what had just happened. Dr. Ashford stood up, his chair rolling backward, and walked off set without a word. By 2:27 a.m., the hospital board had terminated his employment pending investigation. By 3:36 a.m., his administrative access was revoked. By 4:36 a.m., he'd been offered a choice, resign with a severance package and an NDA, or face both state review and federal investigation. He refused the severance. He wanted to fight. The board voted unanimously to terminate him anyway. The State Medical Licensing Board opened a file. The Pentagon submitted an official complaint. Within 72 hours, his medical license was suspended pending review. Margaret didn't watch the news. She didn't read the articles that exploded across local media, then regional, then national outlets. She sat in her kitchen with Jackson, the shadow box on the table between them, and ate the dinner her son had made, pasta and marinara, a little too much salt, perfect because he'd made it. He showed her the clips on his phone. She watched herself being defended by a Navy SEAL commander and a Secretary of Defense and the weight of institutions that didn't forgive the calculated destruction of decorated soldiers. "I'm sorry I had to do it without asking," Jackson said quietly. The SEAL guy said it had to be a surprise or Ashford would find a way to spin it. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You were brave. That's all that matters." 6 months later, Margaret pushed through the doors of Seattle General at 10:45 p.m., her slight limp unchanged, her scrub still one size too large, her badge clipped to her chest exactly where it had been before everything fractured and reassembled into something new. The night shift nurses greeted her with quiet respect, no ceremony, no speeches, just the kind of acknowledgement that comes from colleagues who'd watched the whole story unfold and understood what it meant to stand by someone when standing was hard. David called her every Sunday from the VA rehabilitation facility in Durham. His mobility was returning incrementally, inches of movement, nerve responses that flickered back to life like slow lights in a dark building. He was learning to live in his body again, and in every conversation, his voice carried the knowledge that Margaret had given him that chance. The Pentagon awarded her the Distinguished Service Medal in a small ceremony at the hospital. The CEO himself pinned it to her dress uniform. She wore the uniform once, then hung it in her closet beside the jacket with its hidden unit patch. The night shift continued as it always had. Codes called. Fours ran. Monitors beeped their electronic rhythm. At 11:13 p.m., Margaret made her first rounds checking vital signs, adjusting positions, speaking to patients in the quiet voice that came from understanding pain as information rather than complaint. She passed the new night security guard making his rounds, an ill-fitting uniform that hung loose on shoulders that had once commanded armies, a plastic watch replacing the Omega that had been a gift from a grateful hospital administrator, eyes fixed permanently on the floor. "Dr. Ashford." She didn't acknowledge him. He pressed himself against the wall to let her pass, his presence now a ghost of the power he'd once wielded. She walked past without a word, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor, the hidden patch inside her jacket's inner lining barely visible in the darkness, that faded Special Forces insignia that David's small fingers had stitched there 20 years ago in gratitude, a reminder that some things endured longer than empires, longer than ego, longer than the carefully constructed lies that ambitious men built to climb. At 2:08 a.m., Margaret took her break in the break room and 3 nurses joined her. Elena brought cookies. They talked about normal things, shift schedules, difficult patients, the way the new attending physician remembered everyone's coffee order. Nobody mentioned medals or press conferences or secretaries of defense calling in on live television. That wasn't the story anymore. The story was now the quiet continuation, the night shift that kept running, the hands that kept healing, the nurses who moved through the dark saving lives while the news cycle moved on to the next scandal, the next failure of institutional power. At 4:44 a.m., a young patient's mother watched Margaret adjust and fall with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory honed across 2 decades. "You're very good at this," the woman said. Margaret smiled slightly. "Just doing the job." When she left at 7:13 a.m., dawn breaking over Raleigh like a slow promise, she passed Dr. Ashford one final time near the staff entrance. He was checking a lock, his movements mechanical, his eyes studiously fixed on the door handle. She walked by without a word, pushing through the entrance into the morning light, the hidden patch inside her jacket catching briefly in the sun like a secret finally made visible. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub saving lives in the dark. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever seen someone underestimated and then proven magnificent, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Comment below, have you ever watched someone get erased and then watch them get vindicated? Share your story. Let's build a community of people who remember what real excellence looks like.